This week, the agenda spoke with Ontario's soon-to-be departing Lieutenant Governor, queried if Toronto is becoming a city of no, and looked behind the headlines at the tragic story of a woman named Banaz. The agenda's Week in Review begins with two sides of a very Toronto story. I hear fewer people complaining about the agenda, which they don't mind. I hear more people complaining about, and you'll forgive me for putting it this way, but you've heard it this way before, they don't like the freak show that's attached to the agenda. They would love to be able, my sense, again, living here and seeing public opinion polls and so on, my sense is they don't mind the agenda, they don't like all the extra that comes with it. Would you speak to that?
Sure, I will. And I don't disagree with that comment at all. And it's Rob is responsible for a lot of that, not all of it by any means. The media just fuels it like I've never seen. They'll throw gas on the fire as much as they can. And, you know, Rob, did he have his issues? Absolutely. Is he moving forward? He is, 100%.
You said you didn't know, though, that he was doing drugs when he was doing drugs.
100%.
So if he's doing it again, there's every likelihood you don't know that either, right?
Well, I don't believe for a second that he is. And he's moving forward. He's working out 2 hours a day. He's living a healthy lifestyle. And he's doing really well.
There's no question he looks better, but you know, he told Peter Mansbridge he was never going to take another drink, but he did.
Yeah, he slipped up. You know something?
Couple
There's
times.
no doubt. He slipped up once, and it's going to move forward there.
Okay, but it goes back to the issue of, and I'm not one of these people who wants to spend a lot of time on somebody's private life. We generally don't talk about that here. But if people like the agenda, but they don't like all of that other stuff that goes with it, why shouldn't they vote for Tory or Stintz or Soknacki, where they may believe they can get just as good a conservative agenda and watching those pennies without all the added extra?
Yeah, but the truth of the matter, they aren't conservatives. With David Soknacki, how can you be David Miller's budget chief, increase taxes 27.5% over his tenure of 7 years, and selling off our hydro poles, doing sole source deals for $1.2 billion? Then you have Karen Stintz on the other side, votes with the left the majority of the time. If you actually do your research, anyone, you'll see that the majority of her votes are with the left. And she flip-flops back and forth. She wants to build LRTs out to the people of Scarborough. And again, there's no record to run on.
Councillor Ford, let me just ask you an open-ended general question.
Sure.
Do you think politicians ought to be role models?
Well, I think they should be in all the areas, but they should also be real. You can get the slick-talking politicians like John Tory that get up there and say all the right things and can't make a decision. I'd hate to go into Baskin-Robbins with John Tory with the 31 flavors. You'd sit there for an hour and walk out with vanilla.
Why are you attacking him so much here?
Well, you know something? They want to compare John Tory to Rob Ford, and Rob Ford has about as much in common with John Tory as he does with Olivia Chow. Matter of fact, in certain social issues, I'm sure he probably sides with Olivia more than John Tory. And wait until Olivia gets in the race, and I'm sure she'll be saying her comments about the other candidates as well.
There's a story out there that in 2003, John Tory went to visit your family to get their blessing on his running for mayor. And your mother is supposed to have said to him, okay, John, we like you, you can be the mayor, and then after that, it'll be Rob's turn.
Yeah.
So at some point, your family thought John Tory was okay. What's changed?
You know something? There's a long time from 2003 and 2014. There's a long time from 3.5 years ago. Now, John was the chair of Civic Action. He made it very clear he wants to deliver LRTs along Finch out to the people of Scarborough and North York and Etobicoke. He wants to deliver an LRT on Shepherd, which doesn't make sense whatsoever. And he wants to raise taxes. He wants to have tolls in, and it's documented in Civic Action, which Civic Action, in my opinion, was a waste of time. It was a pedestal for him to try to get his agenda out. They accomplished absolutely nothing. And I'm just speaking the truth. And sometimes it hurts when you hear the truth. I know myself.
The guy who ran for mayor in 2010 deserved to win that election. He ran the best campaign, he had the most relatable policies, he was the only one who really stayed on message and presented a vision, maybe it was a limited vision, but a vision of what he wanted the city to be.
Stop the gravy train.
Right, stop the gravy train. He stayed on message, he was engaged in policy, he had an idea, he put forward some ideas. And when he was a councillor, I mean, we weren't talking about crack, right? Like in the book, I talk about maybe that this stuff was happening behind the scenes, but he was an effective counselor. Even his critics say he's a good city counselor.
Well, let me quote from the book. Here we go. This is quote number 1 from Crazy Town. Throughout his decade as a counselor, Rob Ford never cared what anyone at City Hall thought of him. Instead, he was out earning the admiration of his constituents. He toured subsidized housing. He gave out his cell phone number to anyone who would take it. For the first time ever, residents could get their local councillor, not someone in their office, on the phone. In most areas of Toronto, a councillor's assistant would take that call, forward the issue to city staff for investigation, and then the problem would get added to the heavily backlogged capital repair plan. Maybe a bureaucrat would schedule a Band-Aid solution a few months down the road, but maybe not. With Rob, they would call, and he'd say, "How's next Thursday?" Then have the guy from Public Works at your door, said a staffer from Ford's council days. How much, Robin, of that helps explain why Mayor Ford has essentially been able to break all of the conventional rules of politics without being shamed out of town?
It's entirely responsible.
Entirely.
100%. I mean, in the book, I talk about the impacts of amalgamation and how he has been very effective at stoking that urban-suburban divide. And yeah, this tension that exists after amalgamation. But really, if he wasn't a likable guy, that wouldn't resonate with people. What matters, and I think this is a big lesson and a big takeaway for politicians going forward, is that people feel like their elected officials ignore them. They feel unheard. They feel helpless when they're coming up against a problem. And Rob Ford spent a decade building Ford Nation. One of my favorite details in the book is this scene, and I recently wrote about it in The Star, is this idea that Rob Ford would come home from work every day and check his voicemail and write down all the numbers of the people who phoned him that day on a sheet of paper, and he'd phone them all back, and when he was done, he would put that sheet of paper in a legal box. And over his 10 years as a counselor, he amassed 4 legal boxes filled with, some say more, like well over 100,000 phone numbers. And that is what he used to found his voter database, which is crucial to winning elections. That's how he started off his mayoral campaign. People that he personally phoned back that had a connection to him. It was a huge head start when you think about it.
That's Ford Nation.
That's Ford Nation.
People's names in those boxes. That's Ford Nation.
And people often say, you know, I know he has problems now, but you know what? In 2004, I had this problem, and he called me back, and it just means so much to people. And I absolutely understand why it does mean something to people.
Doug Ford, his brother, also on council, was just on the program before you. And I put to him this notion that I read in your book that the Fords think of themselves as Canada's Kennedys.
Right.
And he really took umbrage at that appellation. Did you hear somebody else refer to them that way?
Yes, in the book, I do try to avoid anonymous sources as much as possible, but in some instances when, especially individuals some of my sources are extremely close to the Ford family, and including extended members of the Ford family. And I got that information in my reporting, that they refer to themselves as the Canadian Kennedys. They consider themselves to be a dynasty. I haven't seen the segment that you filmed with Doug, and I look forward to watching it later. But I have heard Doug say that that's not true. But what is interesting to me is that when you think of what the Canadian Kennedys mean, okay, forget the wording if he's just saying that. I mean, is he saying that they don't consider themselves to be a dynasty? Because
no, he's saying they don't consider themselves to be some, descended from aristocrats in New England and patrician
Right.
and all of that, which is true. They're not.
Well,
they're not like that.
Yeah, I think that when they refer to themselves as the Kennedys, and the way that I phrase it in the book, is that they're saying that they are a dynasty, that they are a political family, maybe like the Trudeaus of Canada.
When you came into office, pretty firmly planted your flag as somebody who said, we're going to make some progress on disability issues as long as I'm in this office. No doubt in part because of your own experiences with polio, and you've had to deal with those challenges your whole life practically.
Yeah.
Do you actually, for example, go to the Premier and say, I want X number of dollars for this, or I want this program put in place? Is that how it works?
No, it wouldn't happen that way. I would never speak to programs specifically or dollar amounts. And we would regularly get letters from people saying, I need you to go to the government and tell them they need to do this and add this amount more money to the budget, and I want this amount spent, and things like that. And we would just send a reply back saying that's just completely beyond our capabilities, where that's not our job. the job of the office of Lieutenant Governor. However, there were various occasions during the term where we met, the Premier and I, Premier McGuinty, and with some of his ministers on occasion, where I felt there were things that I was seeing out in the general public as it related to accessibility that related directly to the mandate of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And after not days or weeks, but after months of observation and asking a number of people, felt that there was a feedback that wasn't getting to either the civil servants who were administering the act or certainly the politicians who were in charge of the act. And so then on a couple of occasions, both the Premier McGuinty and I sat down and talked about it, and he was appreciative of the information. And I felt that the Lieutenant Governor's job description, amongst other things, or the authority that the Lieutenant Governor has, is exactly that is described for Her Majesty the Queen, and that is the right to be consulted and the power to encourage and warn. And on both instances, I simply said to the Premier, this fits somewhere between encouragement and warn. I'm seeing something going off the rails, and for the betterment of the body politic, not the Liberal Party and not the Liberal government, but for the betterment of the body politic, I think you need to know this. And then it was up to him to decide what to do.
There's a line, though, right, that you shouldn't or can't cross in your role. But it sounds like on that occasion you might have snuggled up to the line.
I went up to the line, but not across. In baseball terms, I did not reach over the field over the fence to stop the home run, but it was right to the fence.
Gotcha. You know, I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I want to ask you about some history that took place on your watch. Towards the end of 2012, as many people will remember, Dalton McGuinty retired as Premier, stepped down, and in doing so, at the same time, asked you to prorogue the Ontario legislature.
Yep.
He said things were getting too hot. He was the lifeguard. Everybody out of the pool. Let's give everybody a chance to calm down a bit. Constitutionally speaking, did you have to grant that request?
Yes.
You did. You had no choice.
Yes. There was great confusion about that. And in fact, we had literally hundreds of emails came in over the next number of days and weeks from people. And the comments that were directed to me, mostly polite, sometimes not, but the requests and in many instances the demands were for me to exercise power that I not only did not have, but we would never want anyone in a democracy to have, such as you need to go to the opposition leader and tell him to form a new government. Well, no, that's not going to happen. Order the Premier to come back. Well, no, I don't have the authority to order the Premier to come back.
Do you have, because we saw on the federal scene when, was it Michaëlle Jean who, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper asked for a prorogation, she made him cool his heels for a good few hours while she looked into it. Now, she granted it, but she made him sweat a bit. Did you ever do that to Premier Peterson? McGuinty, I mean?
No, because, I mean, I have a very good staff, and very astute politically, I might add, in terms of what's going on. And so we were fairly convinced that it was going to happen. And so there was, even the day before, we were meeting and discussing the options of prorogation. And the various experts were consulted and came into my office on that same day. So we had actually thrashed out what the options were over several hours, both the day before and the day of.
It's funny that you say you had an inkling that this was up, because I think it took virtually everybody else by surprise. So where did you get the heads up that this might be coming down the road?
It was just a very simple call on a Sunday afternoon saying that the Premier would like to talk to me the next morning.
So his office got in touch with your office,
yeah,
and that's what sent the antennae up.
Sure, and you're going, well, what's it going to be?
And
it's not going to be, you know, if you want to come to the Leafs game, I've got some extra tickets.
So you never went to a Leafs game with the Premier?
No, not with the Premier.
Which raises another question. Can you go to stuff with the First Minister of the day?
I would not do that. I don't think it would be appropriate.
You've got to maintain a distance.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's a respectful one. It's interesting you'd mention that, because even just this morning we were talking about some of the, with one of my assistants, my executive assistant, some of the delightful serendipities that have occurred during my term of office, such as being reintroduced to my great aunt, who at that point was 103, and nobody on our side of the family even knew that she was still alive. And the only reason we became reintroduced to that side of the family, and to her in particular, was that on the Remembrance Day ceremony of 2007, the Premier and I attended the same Remembrance Day ceremony at the legislature. And of course, it was covered live on various television channels. And my great aunt and my cousin, whom I hadn't seen in 40 or 50 years, were watching it and said, gee, we really must get in touch with David. And it led to a tremendous family reunion that took place, and she lived to another couple of years. And as a result of that chance meeting, she gave me her late brother, my great uncle's memorial medallion as a veteran of World War I who had died at the Battle of the Somme. All of that because the Premier and I attended the same ceremony, which was televised.
And it was not a Leaf game.
And it was not a Leaf game.
It was something more somber.
Indeed.
Did the two of you disagree about anything?
Well, I would put it this way. It really wasn't my position to discuss with him things that we might disagree about. That's an imprecise answer, I appreciate, but we would be talking about what his reasonable requests were as it pertained to a separate conversation related to accessibility. The conversation was quite frank. It wasn't, not that it was disagreeable, but I mean, we were, both of us, trying to advance the issue forward in our own understanding.
Hafsa, before I ask you this first question, I want to read something that you wrote in the Ryerson Review of Journalism in the winter of 2013. Here's the quote. In 2011, the Department of Justice commissioned Dr. Amin Mohammed, psychiatry professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, to compile a report on honor killings in Canada. He found that there have been 13 in the past decade, including the Parvez and Shafia murders. The collective hand-wringing after these deaths triggered a terminology debate. When news of Aqsa Parvez's murder first broke, many news outlets used the phrase honor killing without reserve, while others, like the Toronto Star and Global News, referred to the murders as possible cases of domestic violence. Hafsa, tell us why there is this concern in some circles with the use of the expression honor killings.
Well, I had a lot of first-hand experience with this issue, and I struggled a lot myself as to whether I should use the phrase honor killings in my story, and you'll see that I did. A lot of Muslim community members, such as those in the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, who I interviewed, refused to use the word at all. And they said that me being Muslim, using the phrase, I was doing an injustice to my own community, which was very troubling and upsetting. But in the end, I found there was no cultural connotation with the word honor. So I feel like it's okay to use the word honor killings. The motivation behind the murders is, after all, honor. So dishonored, actually. So I think that the phrase honor killings should be used, as that's what it is. But there is a lot of hesitancy to use this.
Mm-hmm. Rob Tripp in Calgary, what similarities do honor killings, so-called, have with forms of domestic violence that, let's say, we're more accustomed to hearing about on our nightly newscasts?
Well, I'm not sure, Steve, that they do have that many similarities, other than the fact that they are killings usually within families, and we're accustomed to studying family violence and domestic violence in Canada, in which an intimate partner kills someone who is a current or former intimate partner. In honor killings, the victim and perpetrator are not always intimate partners. There have been cases in Canada of husbands killing wives, but more of the cases involve a father, an uncle, a brother killing a sibling, killing a child. So that's a huge difference. We're not accustomed to seeing that kind of inter-family violence when we look at domestic violence, anyway, in Canada.
Sure. Aruna, do you find the word honor killing somewhat pejorative?
I use honor killings because it defines exactly how it is different from other forms of violence. The violence against women is a global phenomenon, but how it is manifested is rooted in everybody's culture. Different cultures manifest violence against women in different ways.
But it feels like when you say honor killings, it feels like you're saying, now you tell me if I'm wrong here, but again, in popular Canadian media, when they use the expression honor killings, oh, that's them. That's those South Asians who do that, as opposed to everybody else.
Honor-based violence is not new to Canada. Since 1930s to 1980s, there were 360 young women, unmarried women, who were put away in institutions because they became pregnant without getting married, and they brought shame to the family.
This was the Mercer Reformatory in Toronto.
And they were inmates, they were punished, they were sentenced. So that is honor-based violence in Canada, in the Canadian context.
And that was all white.
And they were all white, and they were all Christians. So this phenomenon of honor-based violence is not new to Canada. Okay, it took a long time for women to fight against it, struggle against it, and talk about women's equality and having the same dignity as men, for example. And not that Canada has reached the epitome of equality, I'm not saying that, but we've come a long way in 30 years. However, honor-based violence, the manifestation of this kind of violence is different than intimate partner violence and domestic violence.
What makes it different?
It is a collective decision, first of all. Then there is community support. There is a collective moral judgment, just like there was a collective moral judgment on unwed mothers. It's similar. They all turn their moral blindness to what is happening to these young women. It is similar in our community as well. I have a great problem with the media saying honor killings and Muslims are the same thing. That is when the Aqsa Pervez thing happened, or Shafia murders happened, media were calling me all the time to comment and comment. Not once did I comment because they wanted me to say, oh, these are Muslim crimes. They're not. They're happening in Hindu, so they're happening in Sikhs, and I'm a Christian. I lived it. I've lived it for 30 years. So the Muslims do not have a monopoly on honor-based violence, honor killings. The minute we stop saying that, we can have a discussion and we can talk about prevention.
Okay, let's start to do some of that right now then. Dia, let me bring you back into the conversation. You told us earlier that when Banaz went to the police and tried to warn them about what potentially could happen to her, their reaction was, in essence, non-existent. Do you think that they might have reacted differently had they had a greater understanding of some of the cultural issues at play here that Aruna has just talked to us about?
Well, I would like to echo what Aruna is saying. I think no society, no group of people in any corner of the world has a monopoly on violence against women. The women are brutalized in every single corner of the world. The form that the violence and the oppression takes will vary from group to group to group, but the end result is the same. You know, in the UK, for example, you have several women a week that are murdered in intimate partner relationships by their intimate partners. You know, so Banaz's end result is she is dead. The white English women I'm talking about, they're dead. So the end result is the same. The brutality is just as severe. And Asian women, Muslim women are no more or less dead than anybody else. So I think it's very important that we, for the sake of the victims and the people who are at risk of this, I think it's crucial that we move the conversation beyond.
Absolutely.
Is it Muslim?
Yeah.
Is it cultural? Is it this? Is it that? I think it is an abuse of people's human rights. I think it is unacceptable that any of our citizens is treated like this or subject to this form of violence. Where the level of understanding must be built is understanding the actual constructs of what these crimes are like, what the traits are, what the players are. For example, you know, you brought up domestic violence earlier, that you will find one intimate partner against another, and you will not find the same collectivity that you find in honor killings. So the reason we need to understand these dynamics and these specific differences in the various crimes is so that we can provide the best possible protection for young people, and particularly women who are at risk of this. And once the crime actually happens, that the crime is investigated accurately. What I do not accept and what I find really frustrating is that people want to make these judgments of it's Muslim, it's this, it's only that. It's besides the point, quite honestly. Yes, it happens a lot in Muslim communities. Yes, it happens also in Hindu communities, Sikh communities, and whatever other communities. The thing is, the suffering of women within minority communities is constantly being made into a political football that is used for people's political or public stands that relates to completely something other than any genuine caring for the suffering of women.
Here's what Richard Florida, the director of the Martin Prosperity Institute, says about the current planning landscape in Toronto. He says, "My sense is Toronto has become a city where it is much easier to say no or veto projects than to do new and important initiatives and projects." Is he right, Jennifer?
No, if he was right, we wouldn't be the fastest growing city in North America. And you know, I've talked to Richard about this, and particularly around the Island Airport as a case in point. The reality is, when you're growing as quickly as we are, there are tough conversations we need to have, and most of those conversations are about scale. The Mirvish-Gary project, it's a question of scale. It's not a question of architecture, it's a question of scale.
This is the plan to put 3 large towers down on King Street.
That's correct. The airport, I think there's a very small minority saying get rid of the airport. I think most of the conversation is about at what point does the airport get too big? And we all know that's an important question.
It's the Island Airport.
The Island Airport, because if you took Pearson and you put it on the island, well, we all know that's absurd. You can't do that. That there's a certain point where you hit a breaking point where something that might be very good for the city right now and very good for the downtown right now, that it can hit a tipping point. And the reality is, we've actually hit a tipping point with respect to ground-related uses, cars and taxis and pedestrians. It's a disaster down there. And those issues need to be fixed in order to ensure that that airport is going to continue to be an asset, as opposed to something that starts to take away from other objectives, like having a spectacular waterfront.
I do some work in the energy sector, and energy is often, particularly in urban environments these days, a flashpoint. And we have had a very active debate in the southwestern part of the GTA over the last few years about energy supply, gas plants, and all the rest of it. And
We've heard something about it.
I have heard something about that. Now, listen, in my old electoral district in the Ottawa Valley, there are 8 or 9 hydroelectric dams. I'm not so sure any of those could be built today. So one of the questions, and I'm a boomer, and I can be a bit self-critical, the boomer generation, we're different than our parents. My parents were products of a different time, and sacrifice was a word and a concept that was very much part of their experience. I have to tell you, I've been very lucky. Spent all my life in Ontario, born in 1951. I haven't been asked to make very much sacrifice. And sometimes public good is about a little bit of sacrifice. And so one of the things that I've come to realize is that, and some of these decisions are very difficult, but on vital commodities like water and energy, sometimes the choices are not as ideal as you would like them. And I think, quite frankly, the processes we've got in some cases now are absolutely self-defeating, because there is absolutely no consequence for saying no.
It feels like in this city that when you want to get something big built, the approach you should take is, okay, I really want to build a 60-story building, so I'm going to ask for 80. They won't give me 80. They'll talk me down to 60. That's what I want in the first place, but I got to look like I'm upset about that. Is that really how it works?
Well, as far as I can tell, a developer doesn't get out of bed in the morning in this town for less than 60 stories. I mean, you walk around downtown. I mean, I'm glad to hear that the chief planner is concerned about 82, 84, and 86 that our friend David Mirvish and Frank Geary want to put on King Street. And frankly, Mr. Geary, the celebrated architect, was quite contemptuous of the process when he came to City Hall. It was shocking to hear him. He said that there were only 2 buildings in Toronto that he felt were worth saving, which were Old City Hall and Osgoode Hall. That was it. Everything else, in his opinion, is a teardown. Queen's Park, teardown.
Not
City
Queen's
Hall.
Park.
I mean, so yeah, there is a certain amount of, I think there's an aggressive, a kind of a confrontational attitude that does exist among those people, and I don't blame them. Like, I think they're taking what the market will get. My bigger issue on this whole thing would be, let's charge them a development charge that pays for all these great infrastructure projects that we desperately need, that we've talked about so eloquently today, and maybe get the scale to sort of match it by saying, hey, you have to pay a certain amount per unit, and we're going to use that to make this city work.
I want to start by reading something Christopher Hume, a Toronto Star columnist, wrote a few months ago in Canada's largest circulation newspaper. He wrote, "The map remains the same, but Toronto and Hamilton have changed places. Until recently, Steeltown was a self-hating city, dismissed by the rest of the world for its coarse ways, unwashed residents, and knuckle-dragging politicians. Today, as Hamilton rises from the ashes of its grimy industrial past, Toronto is consumed by flames of its own setting." Okay, Marvin, is he onto something there?
Well, I'll say partially true. I'm not sure I'd like to say our grimy industrial past. Maybe I can give you some context. In the 1950s and 60s, you'll find articles written about Hamilton as being the city of Canada's future. If something was manufactured in Canada, a version of it was made in Hamilton, whether it be cars or lifesavers or blue jeans. And I think politically at the time, people felt these industries were too big to fail, that famous expression we use about banks. And so people coasted on that for the longest time. And then due to trade and other things, we began to see them whittle away. We lost those industries, but we kept the steel mills. Famously, the view you see over the Skyway Bridge. But even those fell on hard times. There used to be 30,000 people who worked in those steel mills. Today, total between U.S. Steel and ArcelorMittal Dofasco, only about 3,000 people. So 10 years, 15, 20 years ago, this city, Hamilton, went through quite a cultural identity, a crisis, if you will, trying to figure out where they are moving forward. And I think today, it is a city on the rebound. I think it is coming back, although I wouldn't say it's back yet. There's a lot of green shoots. They're growing. They need to be nurtured. But now we're seeing a new economy rise based on education, medicine, on the arts community, a great place to live. The motto today is a city, best city in Canada to raise a child. That's a whole different vision of Hamilton than 25, 30 years ago.
Ryan, it used to be called the ambitious city when I lived there. Does it feel that way today to you?
It's starting to feel that way again after a long absence. It seems like for a long time, Hamilton forgot what it meant to have big plans. We became a city that was desperate for any crumb, and we had a beggars can't be choosers mentality. You know, we didn't demand excellence from developers, we didn't demand excellence from builders and from companies and even from ourselves. And so we're a city that accepted mediocrity for a very long time. That's starting to change. You know, people are looking around and saying, you know what, we can do better, we can demand better, we can produce better.
Jeremy, if things are better, what do you think accounts for that?
A good number of things, and I would sort of put the stake in the ground the same place that Marvin did. Maybe somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, we had this identity crisis as a community, and we could have stayed, and I think for a while got stuck in a rut of waiting for some magic project to land in our city. Who's that massive employer that's going to come in and solve all of this? And at a point, as a group of, whether it's citizens or organizations and institutions, we said, we need to redefine who we are, not forgetting who we were and who the past was, but take all those assets that we gathered over a 50, 60-year period or whatever it was with manufacturing, education, and healthcare and all of those components and figure out who we are as a collective as opposed to who we are as a singular thing.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.